Marcus Bell stood at the arrivals gate of Denver International Airport, holding a bouquet of white lilies, checking his phone for the 9th time in 11 minutes. His wife's flight from Chicago had been delayed. She'd texted, 4 hours delayed, then 6. Weather, she'd said. A ground stop, she'd said. He believed her, because in 11 years of marriage, Elena had never given him a reason not to. He believed her the way you believe a wall is holding until the day it isn't. What Marcus did not know, as he shifted the flowers from one hand to the other and smiled apologetically at a family reuniting beside him, a grandmother weeping into the shoulder of a soldier in fatigues, was that his wife's flight had landed 6 hours early. It had touched down at 2:14 that afternoon, not the delayed 8:30 she'd promised, and it was almost 9 now. Within the next 90 seconds, Marcus Bell would watch a man he had never seen before lift his wife's suitcase from her hand as though he had done it 100 times before. And nothing about the careful, quiet life Marcus had built would ever look the same again. Before we go any further, if you believe that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because this story is going to test that belief in ways you won't expect. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, what city, what country, because I have a feeling this story is going to reach people in places I've never even been, and I want to know who's out there in the dark, listening with me. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what Marcus felt standing there with those lilies wilting under the fluorescent light, you have to understand the kind of man he was and the kind of marriage he thought he had. Marcus was 41 years old, a structural engineer who had spent the last decade quietly building a reputation as the man other firms called when a project was already in trouble. He was the person you brought in when the foundation numbers didn't add up, when a tower's stress calculations had been fudged and someone finally noticed too late to pretend otherwise. He was patient in a way that unsettled impatient people. He did not raise his voice. He did not fill silences. He let a silence sit in the room until whoever had put it there grew uncomfortable enough to break it themselves. He measured things twice, 3 times, before he ever committed to a conclusion. And when he committed, he was almost never wrong. His colleagues joked that Marcus could stand in front of a cracked wall for an hour without saying a word, and then tell you exactly which beam had failed and precisely when it had begun to fail, down to the season. It was a temperament that made him excellent at his job, and he sometimes suspected difficult to live with. Elena had told him once, early on in the first year when everything still felt like a beginning, that being married to him was like being married to a foundation, solid, immovable. And, occasionally, she'd added with a laugh a little cold underfoot. He had loved that description. He had carried it around inside him for 11 years like a small warm stone. He had thought it was affection. Elena Bell was 38. Elegant in the effortless way that made other people feel they had tried too hard, just by standing near her. She worked in corporate hospitality, arranging events and conferences for a firm that flew her around the country to smooth the edges off other people's chaos. She was good at it, genuinely good, the sort of person who could remember the name of a client's assistant and the client's dog and the client's daughter's college major and use all 3 to make a stalled negotiation feel like a dinner party among old friends. Marcus had always admired that about her, the way she could read a room and rearrange its emotional furniture without anyone noticing she'd moved a thing. He had watched her do it at his own firm's events, watched her turn a table of stiff, competitive men into a circle of laughing collaborators. And he had felt, each time, a private pride so large it embarrassed him. He had never once considered that a woman who could do that to a room might also be able to do it to a marriage. He had never once considered that the same skill that charmed a boardroom could construct, brick by patient brick, an entire false life inside the one they shared. They had no children, by a decision they'd made together in their early 30s, and revisited only rarely, always gently, always agreeing. They had a house in a good neighborhood, brick and generous, with a study Marcus loved, and a garden Elena never quite got around to. They had a mortgage that was nearly paid off because of the way Marcus handled money, quietly and relentlessly, shaving years off the term with extra payments Elena never bothered to track. And they had a routine that Marcus found comforting, and Elena, he was beginning to sense in the months before that night, found something else. She traveled more than she used to. The trips ran longer, extended by a day here, a weekend there, always for reasons that sounded plausible when she said them, and slightly less plausible when he replayed them in the dark. The texts came slower. The explanations arrived a beat too polished, the way a witness sounds when they've rehearsed the answer in the mirror before the deposition. Marcus had noticed. Of course, he had noticed. Noticing was the one thing he had never in his life been able to switch off. But noticing was not the same as concluding, and Marcus did not conclude until he had measured. So he had waited and watched and told himself that patience was a virtue, and not, as he sometimes feared, at 3 in the morning, a more dignified word for cowardice. Which is why, when Elena texted that her Chicago flight was delayed and would land at 8:30 instead of the early afternoon, Marcus had simply replied that he'd be there and bought the lilies from the overpriced stand near the parking elevators and driven to the airport a full hour early because that was the kind of husband he wanted to be. He had wanted that night, especially, to be present at the gate when she walked off the plane exhausted. He had wanted her first sight of home to be his face and the flowers. He had planned it the way he planned everything, carefully, with a small margin for error, never imagining that the error was not in his timing, but in the entire premise of the evening. The truth of the flight was simple, and it would take Marcus less than a minute to understand it, though it would take him weeks to fully absorb what that minute had cost him. United Flight 1642 from Chicago, O'Hare had departed on schedule that morning, and, aided by a strong tailwind across the plains, had landed in Denver at 2:14 in the afternoon, 6 hours before the time Elena had given him. There had been no ground stop. There had been no weather. There had been, instead, 6 hours in the city, 6 unaccounted hours that his wife had chosen to hand to someone else while telling her husband she was still sitting at a gate in Illinois, drinking bad coffee, watching the departure board refuse to change. 6 hours. He would learn to hate the exactness of the number. Marcus knew none of this, yet as he stood at arrivals. He only knew that the board above him had begun cycling through the late arrivals, times shifting and dissolving, and that his phone had buzzed 20 minutes earlier with a message from Elena, landing soon, so tired, can't wait to see you. He had smiled at that. Can't wait to see you. He would think about those 4 words a great deal in the weeks that followed, turning them over the way you turn over a coin you suspect is counterfeit, examining the edges, testing the weight, wondering how something so small could be so hollow. He was scrolling idly, the lilies drooping in the recycled airport air, when a movement in the crowd made him look up. Not a dramatic movement, nothing loud. It was the particular ease of it that caught his engineer's eye, the way a trained observer notices a load-bearing wall in a photograph before he notices the people posing in front of it. A man and a woman were walking together toward the exit unhurried, in step, and the woman was Elena. She was wearing the navy coat he'd bought her 2 winters ago and a scarf he didn't recognize. A deep wine-colored thing knotted the way she never knotted her scarves for him. She was laughing. Her head was tilted back, and her whole body was loose with it, the way a person only laughs when they feel entirely safe and entirely seen. And beside her, matching her stride with the unmistakable rhythm of 2 people who have walked a great many places together, down a great many corridors, was a man in his mid-40s, tall, silver at the temples, wearing the kind of unstructured jacket that costs more than it looks like it should and is designed precisely to look like it doesn't. As Marcus watched, frozen the flowers, forgotten at his side, the man reached over without breaking stride and took the handle of Elena's rolling suitcase from her hand. He did it the way you take a coat from someone whose coat you have taken before. He did it without asking, without a glance, without any of the small negotiation that passes between people who are still learning each other. And Elena let him, without a flicker, without a thank you, without any of the polite friction that lives between strangers. She simply released the handle into his open palm and kept talking, and the suitcase rolled on behind him now, as if it had always belonged in his keeping. Marcus stood very still. The lilies hung at his side, white and stupid and useless. And in the part of his mind that never stopped calculating, that had never once in 41 years agreed to look away from a thing simply because it hurt, a single clean conclusion assembled itself out of the evidence, the way a bridge assembles itself out of steel, girder by inevitable girder. The flight had not been delayed. She had been here for hours, here, in this city, close enough to touch, and choosing not to. And this man was not a colleague she had met on the plane, because you do not surrender your luggage to a man you met at 35,000 feet the way you surrender it to a man you have shared a life with in the spaces your husband was never allowed to see. There is a language in a handed suitcase. Marcus read it fluently. He did not call out. He did not move toward them. Some men would have crossed that terminal in 6 long strides. Marcus watched. He watched the two of them walk to the exit. He watched the man say something low, close to her ear, that made Elena tip her head back and laugh again, that same abandoned laugh, and he watched them disappear through the automatic doors into the concrete throat of the parking structure. He noted the time. It was 8:52. He noted that the man had turned left toward the short-term lot, not right toward the pickup lane where a husband would be waiting. He noted that Elena had not once looked toward arrivals, had not once scanned the crowd for the husband she'd told 20 minutes ago that she couldn't wait to see. Not a glance, not a moment's thought. He simply did not exist in the geography of her evening. Then Marcus did something that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew him and would not have surprised anyone who actually did. He walked to a trash can near the exit, and he set the lilies down on top of it, gently, arranging them so the blooms faced up, the way you set down something you no longer have any use for but can't quite bring yourself to crush. And he took out his phone, and he did not call his wife. He opened a blank note, and he began, in his small, precise way, thumbs moving without hurry, to write down exactly what he had seen, the time, the flight number, the navy coat, the wine-colored scarf he didn't recognize, the suitcase changing hands, and the manner of it, the direction they'd walked. He wrote it the way he wrote a structural report, in the flat, unemotional register of a man documenting a fact, because a report is what you build when you intend for the truth to hold weight later, in a room where people will try very hard to make it collapse. He did not know yet what room. He only knew there would be one. An hour later, Marcus was sitting in his car in the airport parking structure, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, when his phone rang. It was Elena. "Marcus?" Her voice was warm, tired, perfect, not a note out of place. "I'm so sorry, honey. I've been going out of my mind. They finally let us board, and then we sat on the tarmac forever. I swear, it was another hour just sitting there. I just landed. Are you still here, or did you give up on me?" He looked at the dashboard clock. It was 9:58. She had walked off that plane at 2 in the afternoon. She had been off it, by any honest accounting, for nearly 8 hours. End quote. "I'm here," Marcus said. His voice was even. He was proud, distantly, of how even it was. "I'm in the parking structure. Take your time. You're the best, you know that. God, I'm exhausted. This trip was a complete nightmare from start to finish. She sighed, and it was such a good sigh, so lived in, so textured with fatigue that never happened, that for one vertiginous second Marcus wondered whether he had somehow imagined the man, the coat, the suitcase, whether his own suspicious mind had conjured the whole scene. That was the terrible thing about a lie told. Well, it didn't just deceive you about the future. It reached backward and made you doubt what you had seen with your own eyes an hour before. There was a crying baby the whole flight, and the drink cart never even reached us. I'll be right down. I love you. I love you too, Marcus said, and he was proud again of how ordinary he made it sound, because in that moment he understood, fully and finally, that he was not going to confront her tonight. He was not going to confront her tomorrow. He was going to do what he always did, the only thing he had ever truly known how to do. He was going to measure. When Elena slid into the passenger seat 8 minutes later, she smelled faintly of a cologne that was not his, something cedar and expensive lingering in the wine-colored scarf, and she leaned across and kissed his cheek and complained about the tarmac and the crying baby in row 19 and the drink cart that never came. And she wove an entire 6-hour delay out of nothing, thread by patient thread, layering in a rude gate agent and a broken jet bridge and a passenger who wouldn't sit down. Marcus listened to all of it and made the appropriate sounds and watched her hands as she talked. He was very good at watching hands. Hands told him things faces had learned to hide. And he thought, with a calm that frightened him a little, that his wife had just constructed, in real time and without a single hesitation, a detailed and vivid account of an afternoon that had never happened, complete with sensory texture and minor irritations and a satisfying arc. That took practice. That took a fluency you did not acquire in an evening. Whatever this was, it was not new, and it was not small, and it had been happening in the very seat she was sitting in for longer than he was ready to imagine. That night, while Elena slept beside him, her breathing slow and untroubled, the sleep of someone with nothing on her conscience, or someone who had made her peace with it long ago, Marcus lay awake and did not rage and did not weep. He built a plan, the way he built everything, from the low down, starting with what had to be true and working toward what he would have to do. And the first thing he did, in the blue light of his phone at 3 in the morning, careful not to move the mattress, was pull up their bank records and their credit card statements. Not because he expected to find anything, because a man who checks his own foundations does not assume they are sound. Simply because he desperately wants them to be. What he found was not dramatic. That was what made it so devastating. It was small and consistent and patient, and it had been going on for a very long time. There was no single damning charge, no hotel room in a strange city on a night she'd claimed to be home. There was worse. There was a pattern, quiet and regular as a heartbeat, hiding in plain sight in the ordinary rhythm of their shared accounts. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus became, in the quiet privacy of his own attention, the investigator he had always been in his professional life, only now the failing structure was his marriage, and the fudged numbers were his own. He did not hire anyone. He did not follow Elena to her garage phone calls. He did not read her messages, both because he found the idea distasteful and beneath the person he wanted to remain, and because he did not need to. People who lie about small things leave large evidence in the places they never think to hide, in the seams of the ordinary. Elena hid her phone, angling it away, taking it into the bathroom. She did not hide the calendar entries her assistant copied him on out of long habit, entries that placed her in one city while she claimed to be in another. She hid her conversations. She did not hide the fact that 4 of her business trips in the past year had been to cities where her firm had no clients and no conferences. A fact Marcus confirmed by the simple expedient of being a curious man with access to public conference schedules and a company website that listed every account they served. She hid the man. She did not hide the recurring charge, small and monthly and easy to overlook, $42 to a storage facility out in Wheat Ridge, a suburb neither of them had any earthly reason to visit. a charge that had first appeared on a shared card 2 years and 3 months earlier and had run, uninterrupted, month after month after month, ever since. 2 years and 3 months. Marcus sat with that number the way he sat with a stress calculation that had come back wrong, refusing to look away from it, forcing himself to feel its full weight. It meant that the laughing woman at the airport, the woman who had told him she couldn't wait to see him, had been maintaining a second life, a life with its own address and its own locked door and its own monthly rent, for longer than some entire marriages last from wedding to divorce. It meant that a great many of the evenings Marcus had spent believing he was in a solid, if slightly cool, marriage had in fact been spent alone in a building whose walls were already gone, sitting content inside a structure that existed only in his own trusting mind. He drove to the storage facility on a Tuesday during a workday, while Elena was genuinely in Phoenix at a genuine conference, one he had verified twice against the client list. He did not break in. He was not that kind of man, and, besides, he did not need to. He simply walked into the front office and told the manager, an incurious young man named Devin, with earbuds in one ear and a video game paused on the counter monitor, that he was there to pay down the balance on the unit registered to his wife, and gave the name Elena Bell, and Devin, who had processed that same card 100 times and had no reason on earth to imagine a problem, pulled up the account and confirmed the unit number and the fact that the balance was current and that both authorized parties were paid up. Both authorized parties. The words settled into Marcus like cold water. He asked mildly, casually, whether the co-signer's contact information could be updated since it seemed to be out of date. Devin, helpful and bored, and eager to get back to his game, read the second name straight off the screen without a second thought. Nathaniel Rourke, and an address, and a phone number Marcus already suspected he'd find if he checked in the call logs Elena took out to the garage. Marcus wrote it in his note, beneath the description of the coat and the scarf and the suitcase and the direction they had walked. Nathaniel Rourke. And then he thanked Devin and drove home, and it was only when he was sitting in his own driveway, staring at the garage door where his wife took her secret calls, that he allowed himself to feel the thing he had been holding at arm's length for 3 weeks. And the feeling was not rage, exactly, and it was not grief, exactly. It was something colder and clearer than either. It was the feeling of a man who has finished measuring and now knows the truth in full and understands that the truth is going to require action and that the action, once taken, cannot be untaken. Nathaniel Rourke, it turned out, was not difficult to find because men like Nathaniel Rourke do not hide. They advertise. They put their names on the sides of buildings. He was a real estate developer, 46 years old, twice divorced, the kind of man whose face appeared in the business section of the local paper, beside phrases like visionary and controversial and aggressive dealmaker. He built luxury condominium towers, the tall glass kind, that go up fast on the strength of investor confidence and impossible timelines, and the assumption that momentum can substitute for prudence. He was, by every account Marcus could find, exactly what he had appeared to be at the airport, a man of appetite and confidence, who took what he wanted without asking, whether it was a suitcase or a wife or a piece of downtown skyline that other people had told him he couldn't have. And here the world, which so rarely arranges its ironies neatly, arranged one so precisely that Marcus laughed out loud, alone, in his study, a short surprised bark of a laugh that he immediately regretted for its bitterness, because he was not a bitter man and did not want to become one. Because Marcus knew Nathaniel Rourke's newest tower, he knew it intimately. He knew it better in certain respects than Rourke did. He had in fact been quietly retained 6 months earlier by a group of nervous investors to conduct an independent structural review of the Rourke Group's flagship project, a 40-story residential tower going up on the west side, after 2 engineers on the original design team had resigned within a month of each other without any public explanation. 2 resignations. In Marcus's experience, engineers did not walk away from prestige projects unless they had seen something they could not unsee and would not put their license behind. Marcus had signed a confidentiality agreement. He had reviewed drawings and soil reports and material substitution orders. He had not, in all of it, connected the developer's name to anything in his personal life, because there had been no reason to, because Elena had never once mentioned Nathaniel, and because Marcus filed his professional and personal worlds in separate, sealed drawers and never let one bleed into the other. But he had spent 6 months with that building's numbers, and the numbers, Marcus knew better than any living person, did not add up. They did not come close to adding up. I want to pause here because this is the moment the story turns, and I want you to sit in it with Marcus for a second, in the quiet of that study with the door closed. Have you ever discovered that 2 parts of your life you were certain were completely separate had been secretly touching all along, running side by side without your knowledge? Because that is exactly where Marcus stood. On one side, a wife who had lied to him for over 2 years and let another man carry her bag through an airport like it was the most natural thing in the world. On the other side, a professional file, protected by law and by his own signature, containing his sober conclusion that the very tower that man had staked his reputation and his investors' fortunes upon was being built on a foundation that could not carry the loads it claimed to carry. Marcus was, in that single instant, the only person in the world who could see the whole picture, both halves at once, the private betrayal and the public catastrophe waiting to happen, and how they belong to the same man. And what he chose to do with that picture is the entire measure of who Marcus Bell was. Here is what a lesser man would have done. A lesser man would have used the file as a weapon, would have leaked it anonymously in the dead of night, time to detonate Rourke's tower and his reputation together in a single blast, and then sat back with a drink to watch the man who took his wife lose absolutely everything in a slow cloud of subpoenas and headlines. Marcus considered it. He would tell people later, when he told anyone at all, that he considered it for exactly one long evening. And he was honest enough not to pretend the temptation had been small, because it had not been small. It had been enormous. It had sat in his chest like a hot coal. But Marcus was a structural engineer before he was a wronged husband, and there was one fact about Nathaniel Rourke's tower that a lesser man's revenge would have completely ignored, and it was the only fact that actually mattered in the end. There were going to be people living in it. Real people, families with strollers in the lobby, children asleep in bedrooms on the 30th floor, retirees who had put the last of their savings into a two-broom with a mountain view, believing the glossy brochure and the reassuring word of a visionary. The building's flaw was not a poetic metaphor for Rourke's rotten character. It was a real defect in a real structure that real human beings were going to sleep inside. Night after night, trusting that someone had done the math. And if it failed the way Marcus's calculations said it could fail, under a heavy enough spring snow load, combined with full occupancy, people would die. And Marcus Bell was constitutionally, permanently incapable of holding human safety as a chip in a private grudge. His conscience simply would not permit the trade. It was not even a decision in the end. It was a limit built into him as deep as the load tables he'd memorized as a young man. So he did the harder thing. He separated them. He decided, in that closed study, that the two facts, the unfaithful wife and the unsound tower, would never once be allowed to touch, because to let them touch would be to lower himself to the exact level of the man he despised, to use the safety of strangers as leverage in a personal wound. The tower he would handle as an engineer, cleanly, through the proper channels, exactly as he would have if he had never seen Elena's suitcase change hands, exactly as if the developer had been a total stranger to his heart. And the marriage he would handle as a husband, or rather as a man who was about to stop being one. 2 separate reports, 2 separate reckonings. 2 sealed drawers that would stay sealed. And in choosing that discipline, that refusal to merge them, Marcus did the one thing that ultimately brought the entire edifice of the lie crashing down more completely and more permanently than any leak ever could have. He kept his integrity intact, and integrity, it turns out, is the one force in this whole story that nobody, not Elena, and certainly not Nathaniel Rourke, ever once thought to account for in their calculations. They had planned for jealousy. They had planned for rage. They had never planned for a man who would simply do the right thing and let it fall where it fell. The engineering came first because lives were on the line, and Marcus did not believe in delay when delay carried a potential body count. He completed his independent review with the same cold rigor he would have applied to a stranger's building, checking each figure 3 times, and he submitted it to the investor group and, as his professional and ethical obligations legally required, to the city's building safety division. His report was not vindictive. It contained no adjective that did not serve a load calculation. It was worse than vindictive for Rourke because it was simply unanswerably correct. It documented in language no permitting authority in the country could ignore that the tower's foundation had been designed to the wrong soil classification, that the actual ground beneath it was softer and less stable than the drawings assumed, that a substitution of a cheaper grade of structural steel had been quietly made during construction without anyone recalculating the resulting load capacity, and that the structure, as built, could not be certified for human occupancy without extensive, expensive, and time-consuming remediation. It was the kind of report that stops a project cold in a single afternoon. It was the kind of report that turns a visionary into a defendant. Marcus filed it on a Thursday morning, and then he went to lunch alone and ate a sandwich and read a book and did not think about it, because his part was finished and the rest was no longer in his hands. He did not know, and did not need to know, that the same investor group had been growing quietly uneasy about Rourke for months, that his aggressive timelines and razor-thin margins and evasive answers had begun to smell like the particular kind of risk that ruins the people foolish enough to finance it. Marcus's report did not, on its own, create Rourke's downfall. It simply removed the last beam, holding it up, and the whole thing came down under its own accumulated weight. Within a week, the city issued a stop work order and hung the notice on the chain-link fence for every passerby to read. Dow. Within 2 weeks, the investors moved to freeze their funds and retain lawyers who specialized in exactly this kind of unwinding. Within 3 weeks, Nathaniel Rourke, the man who took what he wanted without asking, discovered that he was personally and ruinously liable for the cost of remediating a 40-story mistake, and that the vast paper fortune he had leveraged against the tower's success was now leveraged catastrophically against its very public failure. The visionary, it emerged in the filings, had been building his own life on the identical flawed foundation as his tower. He had bet everything he had, and much that he did, not on the single assumption that no one would ever look too closely at his numbers. And he had built that assumption without ever knowing the man existed directly in the professional path of the one engineer in Denver who looked too closely at everything, always, whether you wanted him to or not. And Marcus, who had done none of this out of revenge, who had done all of it because it was the only right thing to do, went home each of those long evenings and said nothing and watched his wife. Elena's afternoons grew strange in those weeks, and Marcus, who missed nothing, watched the change arrive in her the way he watched a hairline crack widen across a wall he had already condemned. He watched her check her phone with a new tightness around her eyes and mouth. He watched her take calls in the garage, the door pulled down, her voice, a low, urgent murmur he did not need to hear to understand. He watched the polished confidence he had once found so admirable begin to fracture, not in the way a person fractures, under the suspicion of an affair, not with guilty glances at him, but in the entirely different way a person fractures when the man they've secretly bet their whole future on is suddenly, publicly, irreversibly failing. She did not know yet that her own husband had written the report that shut the site down. She only knew that Nathaniel's world was collapsing in real time. In the newspaper she read at breakfast, and that a woman who has spent 2 years and 3 months carefully building an escape hatch into another man's success does not have an escape hatch anymore. She had chosen Rourke. Marcus understood now with perfect clarity, not merely for the affair, but as a destination. An entire second life she was slowly moving into one storage unit, and one weekend at a time. She had been, in her own patient way, doing exactly what Marcus had spent his whole life training himself to do. She had been measuring, and she had concluded, somewhere in those 2 years, that Marcus was the foundation she would step off of, and Rourke was the gleaming tower she would step into. And now, the tower had a stop work order nailed to its fence. He let her stew for 11 days, not out of cruelty, though he understood how it might look. Out of the very same instinct that made him check a calculation 3 separate times before he trusted it. He wanted to be certain that when he finally spoke, he would be speaking from the truth and not from his own raw hurt, that not one word out of his mouth would be something he would later have to take back or be ashamed of. On the 12th day, a Sunday, gray and still, Elena came into his study looking older than he had ever seen her look, the polish gone, and sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. Marcus set down his pen and looked at her and waited, because he had learned long ago that if you wait long enough and say nothing, people will fill the silence with the very thing they came into the room to hide. "I need to tell you something," Elena said, "and I need you to try to understand it before you say anything." Marcus folded his hands on the desk. "All right," he said. She told him a version of the truth, not all of it. Elena was far too skilled for all of it, even now, even cornered, even with her escape hatch welded shut. She told him she had grown lonely in the marriage, that his coldness and his silences had slowly pushed her toward a warmth she'd found somewhere else, that it had been a mistake, one she deeply and genuinely regretted, and, crucially, one that was already over and done with. She did not use Rourke's name. She said there had been someone briefly, and it was finished, and she was choosing to tell him now because she wanted their marriage to survive, and it could only survive on a foundation of honesty. She actually used that word, foundation. Marcus felt something in his chest that was almost grotesquely admiration for the sheer audacity of it. That she would sit in the study of a structural engineer, a man who had spent his life determining whether foundations would hold, and offer him a false one as an act of contrition and expect him not to test it. He let her finish. He let the silence sit after she stopped talking until it grew heavy in the room. And then he spoke, and his voice was very calm and very quiet, quieter than she had ever heard it. And Elena would tell people afterward that it was the quietest and most frightening thing she had ever heard in her life. "His name is Nathaniel Rourke," Marcus said. "The storage unit in Wheatridge has been in both your names for 2 years and 3 months. And it wasn't brief, Elena, and it isn't over. Or it wasn't until about 3 weeks ago when it stopped being over, because his building got a stop work order and he stopped returning your calls in the garage." Elena's face did something complicated and terrible, a slow collapse from behind the eyes outward. Marcus watched it the way he watched a wall he had already known was going to fail, without surprise and without any pleasure. She did not deny it. That was the most interesting thing of all. She had built her entire defense on the careful assumption that Marcus knew a small, vague, forgivable piece of the truth, and she had prepared no fallback whatsoever for a Marcus who knew all of it, calmly, in order, with the dates and the names and the exact rent memorized. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside a car passed and was gone. "How long?" she finally said, and her voice had lost every bit of its practiced music. "How long have you known?" "Since the airport," Marcus said. "Since I stood at arrivals with a bunch of lilies, watching him take your suitcase out of your hand, like he'd done it 1,000 times. You told me your flight was delayed 6 hours. It landed 6 hours early. I was there, Elena. I saw the whole thing. I saw you laugh. And I sat with that for a while, because I don't think I'd seen you laugh like that. With me, in about 3 years. He was not shouting. He never once raised his voice through the entire conversation, from the first word to the last. And that, more than any accusation he could have hurled, was what finally broke the last of Elena's composure into pieces. Because a shouting man can be managed. A shouting man is inside the argument with you, down in it, and an argument she knew could always be won, or at least survived. But Marcus was not in the argument at all. Marcus was standing entirely outside it, looking in, the way an engineer stands in front of a cracked and doomed wall with his clipboard, and there is nothing on earth you can say to a man who has already finished writing his report and signed his name at the bottom. "I want a divorce," Marcus said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. Given the storage unit, and the timeline, and the joint finances, this is going to be very simple, and I promise you, I will be scrupulously fair, right down to the last dollar, because I am genuinely not interested in punishing you. I need you to hear that part clearly. I could have punished you. I had every tool a man could ask for. I chose not to use a single one of them. And I need you to understand exactly what kind of man you decided to step off of, because I don't think you ever actually knew. And here is the part of this whole story that I find I truly cannot stop turning over in my mind late at night." Elena, in that moment, sitting in the wreckage of it, asked him the one question that people always ask, the question that reveals, finally and completely, that they never understood the person sitting in front of them at all. "The building," she said slowly, the pieces sliding together behind her eyes. "Nathaniel's building. The report that shut the whole thing down. That was you, wasn't it? You did that." Marcus looked at her for a long, long time before he answered. "Yes," he said, "but not for the reason you're about to believe. I didn't know it was his building until after the airport, until after I found his name on your storage unit. And when I found out, I had a decision to make, and I made it that same night. I decided that the tower and you were going to be two completely separate things that never touched, because there are going to be people living in that building someday if anyone ever fixes it properly, and I was not going to gamble with the lives of strangers to get even with a man for taking my wife. So I wrote the exact report I would have written if I had never seen you at that airport. I did my job, I checked the numbers, and I told the truth about them. And the truth happened to be extremely inconvenient for him, in precisely the same way the truth turned out to be inconvenient for you. That's the whole thing, Elena. That is the only weapon I ever used against either one of you. I just told the truth, and I let it carry the weight it was always going to carry." Elena left that night, not thrown out, not dragged, not with any scene at all. She simply packed a bag and was gone, because there was genuinely nothing left in that house for her to stand on, no ground beneath her, no argument to win, no version of the story in which she came out whole. The divorce proceeded exactly as Marcus had promised it would, cleanly and fairly, without a single cruel maneuver or petty withholding. And the fact that Marcus refused, absolutely and to the end, to be cruel to her, turned out to be the most damning judgment of all, because it left her nothing to push against, no villain to cast herself as the victim of, no story she could tell her friends or herself in which she was anything other than the woman who had betrayed a decent and endlessly patient man for a fraud whose tower was seized by a court before the first tenant ever carried a single box through the door. Nathaniel Rourke's story ended where those stories usually end, in a thick stack of bankruptcy filings and a civil suit brought by his furious investors and a professional reputation so thoroughly and publicly demolished that his very name became, in the small, tight world of Denver development, a cautionary phrase muttered over drinks. And he and Elena did not, in the end, build a life together out of the ruins. There is a bleak and perfect symmetry to that, which Marcus took no pleasure in whatsoever, though he understood it perfectly, the way he understood load and stress and failure. Elena had left a foundation for a tower, and the tower had been condemned before she could ever move into it. She had traded the solid, immovable thing for the tall, impressive thing, and discovered far too late that the impressive thing had nothing at all underneath it, nothing but soft ground and cheap steel, and a confident man's assumption. She had failed to measure. She, who could read any room in an instant, had believed exactly the way Rourke believed, that no one would ever look too closely at the numbers underneath the shine. And she had been catastrophically wrong about the one single person in her life she should have understood the best. Marcus kept the house. He repainted the study a warmer color that summer, and he opened the windows, and he did not, as far as anyone who knew him ever heard, once pick up the phone to gloat, not to Elena, and not to anyone, because gloating simply was not in him, and because there was nothing to gloat about anyway. Only a marriage that had been quietly hollow for years, and had finally, almost mercifully, been allowed to come down. About a year later, the tower changed hands. It was purchased for pennies on the dollar by a firm with actual competence and no interest in cutting corners, and the remediation work began, guided in significant part by the specific recommendations laid out in Marcus's original report. And there is something almost beautiful, I think, in the plain fact that the building will stand eventually and will hold real families safely through real winters, precisely because one wronged man refused to weaponize its flaws, even against the person who had hurt him more than anyone ever had. His integrity did not only protect his own soul from rot, it reached out and protected strangers he would never meet, would never know the names of, families who will sleep soundly for decades inside walls, made safe by a man they will never once think about. So let me leave you tonight with the thing Marcus Bell figured out. Standing at that arrivals gate with a bunch of white lilies he would never give away, watching the load-bearing wall of his life quietly fail. The people who lie, the arrogant ones, the ones who take whatever they want without ever bothering to ask, they all share a single fatal assumption, and it is this: they assume that no one is really looking. They assume that the quiet man with the flowers isn't measuring, that the patient woman across the desk can be managed with one well-chosen word, that the numbers buried down in the foundation will never once be checked by anyone who knows how to read them. And they build their entire lives, brick by confident brick, on top of that one assumption. Well, but the truth is a load, and every lie is a beam that was quietly substituted with something cheaper, and sooner or later a heavy enough winter always comes, and someone who knows how to look finally looks at the numbers. Marcus never once had to raise his voice. He never had to seek revenge or leak a file or say a single cruel word. He simply refused to look away, and he told the truth, and he let the truth do the one thing the truth always does eventually. It carried the weight, patiently, until the lie could no longer carry its own, and then it stepped aside and let the whole thing come down exactly where it had been built to fall. I truly believe that the single most powerful thing any of us can ever do when we have been deeply wronged is to refuse to become the very thing that wronged us. Marcus could have destroyed two people out of pure spite, and no one would have entirely blamed him for it. Instead, he did his job, kept his conscience clean, and let the consequences fall precisely where the people involved had with their own hands built them to fall. So, I want to ask you, honestly, in the comments below, what would you have done in Marcus's place? Could you have kept those two files separate, the personal wound and the professional duty, when merging them would have felt so instantly and completely satisfying? Be honest with yourself. I would genuinely love to know. And if this story moved you tonight, please take a moment to like it and to subscribe, because I have many more stories exactly like this one coming. Stories about the quiet people who spent their whole lives being underestimated and the loud people who never once saw them coming until it was far too late. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the very end. And remember this, the next time someone assumes you aren't paying attention, the ones who are certain no one is watching are always in the end the easiest ones to catch, because the person measuring in silence, saying nothing, missing nothing, is the one you should never have ignored.